Thank you, Lex, and thank you for those who sort of passed our abstract to present. I'm presenting on behalf of Kelly Kobe, who is on parental leave with this very healthy young lady. And I'm obviously presenting also on the rest of the for the rest of the team. And we don't have any conflicts of interest to report. Okay, so reproducing previously published studies to determine if they replicate helps us to discern discoveries from false leads. And Begley and Ioannidis in 2015 produced this very nice paper giving lots of examples of reproducibility failure across a spectrum of preclinical studies. And one might ask, how did these studies go on to the pipeline of clinical research, etc.? Wouldn't we sort of pick up these failures at the preclinical stage and perhaps not waste, as Paul Glazier mentioned on Thursday evening, very large sums of money? In 2015 as well, the Open Science Collaboration published a really landmark study where they investigated 100 psychology experiments from 3 leading journals. And what they found is that in 36% of the replications were statistically significant compared to 97% of the original studies. And they also found that only 47% of the effect size estimates were in the boundaries of the 95% confidence intervals of the original studies. So in psychology, I guess they're raising a red flag, suggesting that there might be some problems. And so what we wondered is this unique to psychology, or does it go across disciplines as well? So we aim to synthesize the literature on reproducibility and describe its epidemiological characteristics, including how reproducibility is defined and assessed. Because if it's defined and assessed in different ways across disciplines, that might have problems for example, the prevalence of reproducibility. We also wanted to determine and compare estimates of reproducibility across fields. So we used very traditional scoping review methodology. And importantly, we registered our protocol and open science framework prior to any data collection. And I'm just going to read some of the eligibility criteria. We included all quantitative replication studies published in 2018 and 2019. Studies that explicitly self-described as a replication or reproducibility study were included. We did not require the methods to be perfectly matched as per Nozick and Errington's approach. We excluded literature that was not published in English for feasibility reasons. We excluded conference proceedings, commentaries, and narrative reviews, again, for ability to get the work done, so to speak. So we completed some very extensive searches across multiple databases. 2 members of our team were very experienced expert information specialists. We had data extracted independently by 2 members of the team. And we did a lot of piloting. This, as I'm sure you know, is a very messy field. And so lots of piloting went on in the studies. So we did a lot of searching, and we came up with 11,000 records. 2 members of the team are in Knowledge Synthesis Rehabilitation Center. to get over all of the screening that they had to do. We came up with 47 studies that included 177 documents. About 50% of the replication studies were in psychology, and about another 25% were in health sciences, and very few replication studies are in other fields. In terms of reproducibility characteristics, in terms of different disciplines, we found that studies related to psychology and health sciences tended to use comparisons of effect sizes to define replication success. And it's really difficult to comment on other fields because there's very few studies, replication studies. In terms of prevalence of reproducibility, we found that about 50% of the studies that authors did replicated. These are not, we didn't ourselves go and replicate. About 20% of studies failed to replicate, and about 5% produced mixed results. The reproducibility rates were highest in health sciences and economics, and lower in biomedicine and education and psychology. And we were able to extract p-values from most of the studies. I want to leave you with two messages. Well, one is a self-portrait. Two is that the paper is in open science framework. It's 42 pages long. I probably missed some details. It is in revision in what we think is a wonderful journal. So hopefully everybody is going to see that shortly. So thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Your paper is open for discussion, and the first person is already walking towards the microphone. Please go ahead.
Yes, Florence McGraw, Georgia State University. I want to make sure I understand one of your methodological things. You excluded replication studies where they were published in the same journal. Is that correct?
No.
Okay, never mind. That's
So one of the limitations, though, that I do want to mention again, that's in our paper, is that we actually excluded replications that may have been part of an original study. So in some areas of medicine, for example, genomics, replications are sort of part of the process, and we did exclude those.
Okay. Please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Angela Webster, University of Sydney. Thanks for that presentation. I wondered if you could reflect on how publication bias might be impacting what you see, given your selection criteria.
I think it's very possible that it's infiltrated this as it has infiltrated most of what we do.
That's a nice answer.
Malcolm
Please,
McLeod,
the lady in the back there.
Malcolm McLeod from Edinburgh. Thanks, David. One of the criticisms that's been levelled at the methodological terrorists has been that they've deliberately selected for replication efforts findings which they consider unlikely to replicate. Did you get a sense of how many of these replication efforts randomly selected findings, or what the selection process was? Because I think that's important.
I don't think we got a sense of that, because I don't think we see enough replications sort of going across fields. I think in psychology is clearly the dominant field in studies of reproducibility, and that obviously needs to change.
Question in the front, please.
It's Rachel, actually, from the Center for Reproducible Science in Zurich. So if I understood correctly, you said that the percentage of replication success, that was the one that was reported by the authors of the replication study, right?
Correct.
But then you also have different definitions of replication success. So could you comment on whether this might have a, like, if you would then use another definition to define replication success, then the authors, like, that would maybe, like, is it very is it really comparable? You know what I mean? Like, depending on the definition.
Right. So I just want to make sure I understand your question.
Yeah.
So you're saying that if people use different definitions, so for example, if they use p-values or if they
Exactly,
use
yeah.
effect sizes.
Yeah.
Yeah. The vast majority of studies in our sample were using effect sizes.
Mhm.
And so it is possible for sure that if you use different definitions, you're going to get different estimates of prevalence.
Exactly.
And that's been shown about 30 years ago. We did this in abdominal aortic aneurysms. We got our hands on a very large database, and there were different definitions. And then when we applied the different definitions, what we found is the prevalence of aortic aneurysms changed, which is a bit problematic because aortic aneurysms can have somewhat of an effect on a human. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. There are questions online, I suppose.
Gerben.
Michael, go ahead.
Yes, Gerben Turiet of Amsterdam University asks if in the set of 11,000 references, you found any non-quantitative or qualitative studies attempting replication.
We excluded them.
Why did you do that?
Okay.
It's not a good thing.
We're not heavily funded to do this.
Okay, well, you can get away with
We
it.
wanted to live.
Please go ahead.
David, hi, Cameron Abassi from BMJ. Can I ask you a more philosophical question? I'm sure your work is very excellent. I mean, clearly, we don't need persuading of the value of replication, of replicating science or previous studies, previous findings. But, that runs counter to what most, this journals are trying to do. They want to be something new, original. I mean, what arguments might you propose to change that landscape, to change that culture, and how much replication is enough?
Thank you. Great question. They're all good questions. Well, I think it depends on what field you're in, Cameron. I mean, I would say in biomedicine, we should probably, the example that I will use is I have an incoming master's student, and he may not know yet, but he's going to write a chapter on reproducibility for his thesis. And I think we need to start at that level to really get early career researchers, students involved in what are the issues of reproducibility. We need to sort of compare that to, I think, what Paul has shown and many others. There's enormous waste of research. And if you look at the Bagley and Ioannidis paper, I mean, what interests me about that paper is that it's at the preclinical level. So why are we sort of going further down the pipeline to do randomized trials if those preclinical studies can't be replicated? So I think we need to make it people more aware of the problems and not see it in a negative light, but see it as something quite positive.
First the microphone in the back, and then we come back in. Go ahead.
Professor David, I remember reading the paper, the publication, and I remember, correct me if I am wrong, but you and your team saw higher replicability between health sciences when compared to psychology, right? But why do you think, how do you explain this finding? Because psychology is clearly like in the front of this debate.
Good question. And I think it's definitely an anomaly in terms of what other studies have shown, that psychology seems to be better at reproducibility. But if you take it in the landscape of a systematic reviewer, It's simply a data point among many data points. So I'm not too worried about it, but it's a data point.
Okay,
Thank you.
microphone there.
Les Citrom, Current Medical Research and Opinion. I have a question. Did you include drug development studies? They're often repeated in efforts to gain regulatory approval. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes many studies are done in order to achieve the required number of studies to convince regulatory agencies.
If it was part of a sort of a part of an original study and that replication was part of that, we definitely didn't include it. And that's certainly one of the limitations of what we've done. If it explicitly stated that it was a study of reproducibility, it was definitely included.
Steve.
Hi, Steve Goodman, Stanford. So I'm just going to make a general statement about reproducibility, which is, I think we've been studying reproducibility in clinical research for 40 years in the form of meta-analyses. These, you look at a meta-analysis, you have 10 quote unquote replications of study of that phenomenon. We don't call them replications. And in fact, we don't study them as, is one significant or was not. We view them in terms of evidence aggregation. The vast majority of these meta-analyses are statistically homogeneous. So you wouldn't judge them to be inconsistent. Those, when we have statistical heterogeneity, then we look for reasons of conflict. Then we get this new era where we're looking at what we call replications of reproducibility, which is a completely different paradigm, which mirrors the deterministic science model, where one experiment contradicting cold fusion can contradict another. But we've been engaging this for a long time. We've seen a lot of statistical consistency. We don't call it replication. We call it evidence aggregation and exploration of heterogeneity. So I'd be interested in your thoughts about how these two different paradigms cohere, and the statement that we don't have that much replication, not that you've said, but in biomedicine when we have it on a massive scale.
Sure. Well, thanks, Steve. I mean, I think it would be a really good debate, because I think if you look at Jesse Berlin, who said, heterogeneity is our friend. I'm not sure that looking at meta-analysis in particular, that it is a homogeneous set of studies that are together. If one looks at forest plots, I don't see the point estimate, coming down across studies. So I think it's a good question. Is a meta-analysis, is it a proxy for reproducibility? And I think in the case of homogeneity, it may be, but I think what we see in the meta-analysis field is that we see people closing their eyes, stopping their brain, and simply saying, oh, I have a statistical power tool, stata, or I'm just going to push them together. So I'm not sure that there is homogeneity, and I think it needs to be explored as to whether forest plots are a proxy for reproducibility.
Okay, thank you. Let's say a much bigger conversation.
Exactly, it's a new conference you just designed together. I've got a small question, but a real question I'm struggling with myself, David. In my small country, the Netherlands, we have a dedicated research program for replication studies. And I'm privileged to be the chair of that program. And it's so successful that now the money is gone. And we started discussions about a next tranche of that program. And the debate is, should we do it again, a dedicated program for application studies, or should we move on and mainstream it and have the option to replicate in every research program,
right?
Knowing that innovation still is a lot more sexy than replication, and that many people, and your question alluded to that as well, don't realize that sometimes, and maybe even often, replication is much more important than innovation.
Yes. Well, I think you're very lucky, Lex, in terms of where you live and the funders that will do that. I live in Canada, and what I can tell you is the ability to get funding for open science, the ability to get funding for reproducibility is less than zero. and you know, I think until we have sufficient number of funding agencies around the world that have streams for reproducibility and open science, maybe both together, I think we have to continue on and not make it mainstream. I wish it was mainstream in
It's
Canada.
not yet. So it's too early. That's
Oh,
what you're saying. Yeah.
Way too early in
Thank
Canada anyway.
Well, thank you again,
Yeah.
David, for
Okay.
this